I entered the restaurant and looked around. I found my ex-wife at a corner table, but her husband was nowhere to be seen. It had been 10 years since our divorce, and admittedly, it was still hard for me to be around her. I kept wondering if I should go out with her. I finally decided to go out with her. I hope it won't be a mistake. My ex-wife still looked good, but the years were starting to take their toll. I also noticed that she seemed to be very nervous. I thought back to the day my marriage and my life fell apart. It took years and many hours of therapy to get my head back on straight. It all started in a medical clinic. "Mr. Williams, your report is ready," the secretary called. I almost didn't hear her, because I was in a state I didn't know if I would ever get out of. Slowly, I got up and walked to the front desk window. A receipt for payment slid across the counter, which I signed. Then an envelope was handed to me. I looked at it with growing fear. It was a plain envelope with only my name, Justin Williams, on the outside. I knew, however, that its contents would probably ruin my life. Numbly, I crossed the road into the park and found a secluded bench. I didn't even pay attention to the drizzling rain and the dampness of the bench. I just focused on the envelope. Then with trembling hands I opened it. There were a lot of words in the report that I didn't understand. Still, I caught on that it was a DNA test and that 4 people had been tested to see what kind of relationship they were in with each other. One of them, of course, was with my DNA. The other 3 were my wife Amber, daughter Jennifer, and son Todd. It took me 3 times to realize what the report was about. Obviously, 2 of my children were related on their mother's side and had the same father. However, I was not that father. I broke down and began to cry. After 17 years of marriage, finding out that my whole life had been a lie was too much. I didn't know what to do or think. Yeah, it was a shotgun wedding or something. Amber went with Jimmy Swanson almost all through high school. I used to think he was a pretty nice guy. He was also the quarterback of our soccer team. That's not as important as it sounds, because we usually had a crappy team. I should know, because I was the starting middle linebacker. Since our school was relatively small, if you went out for the team, you made sure you dressed. My first year I was a backup, but for the next 3 years I was the primary. The first 3 years our team only won 5 games. But my senior year, for some reason, we won 6-2 and won the regional championship 9-7. Jimmy was absolutely crap that day, but the defense played great. But the season ended abruptly when we got destroyed in the divisional round. Jimmy and Amber had been dating for as long as I could remember. But then something happened, and they broke up a couple weeks before graduation. Then Jimmy left town to join the military. He made occasional appearances until he finally left the army after 9 years of service and came back to the neighborhood permanently. After the graduation ceremony, I was at one of our graduation parties when I ran into Amber. She came up to me and before I knew it, we were already fucking until we passed out. In my imagination, this was the only opportunity and my little head couldn't miss it. Truth be told, I expected our relationship to end there. However, that was not so far from the truth. For weeks after we fought, Amber cornered me at Pizza Hut. She was pregnant and I was the father. It was another case of me not knowing what to think, what to do, or what to say. However, I didn't cry. Instead, I went and talked to the father. It was the most difficult conversation I ever had with him. He was disappointed in me, of course, but he wanted me to do the honorable thing. So we got married. Even though we were both 18, Amber didn't want to tell her parents she was pregnant until after we were married. My father arranged it, and 2 days later we eloped to a neighboring state. Amber called my parents from our honeymoon, if you could call it that, 3 days at a Best Western hotel. They weren't too pleased, but quickly adjusted to the new situation. Amber's parents, Fred and Janice Barton, were a very conservative old money couple. Nevertheless, they held traditional values and tried to instill a work ethic in their children. Fred was a bank vice president and his wife, Janice, was a stay-at-home mom. They had 3 children, Julie, Sarah, and Amber, with Amber being the youngest. It took a few years, But eventually the Burtons got over the idea of us being married, and they began to like me. Over the years I became very close to Amber's parents, especially Fred. He often told me that he thought of me as the son he never had. So I was deeply upset when Mr. and Mrs. Burton were killed in a car accident 5 years after we were married. Our married life with Amber was not all rainbows and unicorns. She could be very moody and demanding. And when Amber wasn't happy with me, she thought nothing of denying me sex. In fact, we only had sex once or twice a week, and if she was mad at me, we could go weeks without having sex at all. I'm sure a lot of people will wonder why I put up with this. Well, to be completely honest, I was completely naive, plus I was in love. I was very young when I got married and I had only had sex with 2 other girls before Amber told me she was pregnant. So I thought it was normal, and I thought Amber loved me in her own weird way. However, there were times when I would reach my breaking point and tell Amber that I was thinking about divorce. Then things would get better for a while. I was accepted to Florida State University before I got married, but that plan didn't work out. Instead, I went to community college to study business administration and marketing. To pay the bills, my father hired me to work in his mail order business. He started it and turned it into a multi-million-dollar business. Dad's company sold expensive camping and fishing equipment. I started at the bottom, but my dad paid me enough to make ends meet. Amber refused to work until Todd was old enough to go to kindergarten. Then she took a job as a real estate salesman. But it was more of a hobby for Amber, since the most she made in a year was $11,000. She definitely wasn't one of the best salespeople, as she was never particularly motivated. I paid all the bills and earned more and more each year as I moved up the ladder in my father's company. As I sat on the bench, it became abundantly clear to me that I had been played for all these years. And I knew immediately that the biological father of my children was Jimmy Swanson. But I didn't understand why Amber stayed with me. I could understand her being embarrassed about being pregnant and single. Knowing her parents, the blow would have been very hard. But after Jennifer was born, Amanda could have divorced me, and I doubt her parents would have paid attention. And having another child with Jimmy 3 years later was just crushing. There had to be more to what was happening than I knew. "Are you okay?" A voice intruded on my sadness. When I looked up, a policeman in a rain suit was staring at me. He was listed on his name tag as Officer Sullivan. He watched me while I nodded. I expected him to walk away, but instead he sat down. "You want to talk about it?" he asked, leaning back on the back of the bench. "Sometimes it's good to talk about your problems. At least it won't hurt." I thought about it for a second and decided why not. I needed someone to talk to, so why not a stranger? Wiping my eyes, I explained to Officer Sullivan my discovery that my wife had cheated on me and that my 2 children were not mine. "Wow," he said, shaking his head slowly, "and I thought my ex-wife was the coldest bitch in the world. I found out after the divorce that she cheated on me on our wedding day. She was very discreet, but if she wanted to fuck someone, she fucked them. I was married to her for 5 years until I figured her out and caught her with a detective from my precinct. I walked in on them fucking. That nasty Detective Peterson tried to climb out the window. But I caught him by the hair and dragged him back into the room. Then I slammed his nose into the floor, breaking it. Blood spurted from everywhere, and Peterson rolled around on the floor and moaned. My wife had just sat on the bed the whole time and smirked. I realized at that moment that I had to get out of there or I was going to kill that bitch. "What happened?" I asked, forgetting my own pain for a moment. I called my captain and explained what the matter was and what I had done. He immediately sent 2 officers to pick me up and 2 more to pick up Detective Peterson. The next day I was immediately transferred to a precinct across town until I cooled down, and Peterson was dealt with. They took care of Peterson? How? When the dust had settled, my wife was out of town with a cashier's check for all our money. Peterson was sitting at the desk, and no charges had been filed against me. Then I learned that my captain had spoken to the bank manager the day after my run-in with the detective. Unfortunately for my wife, she didn't notice that the check wasn't signed. She was in such a hurry to get out of town because my co-workers had warned her that I was hunting her with my service weapon. For weeks she tried to get someone to sign the check. By then, however, our accounts were frozen. Peterson resigned a month later when he realized the blue wall had closed ranks against him. I divorced my wife and made it so she had to fight for every penny she got. From what I heard, she was in California with the other whores. I can't say the officer's narration did much to lessen my pain, but at least it opened the lid to a little bit of leaking out. My advice to you is simple, Officer Sullivan said abruptly. Don't do anything stupid. I know you probably want to kill your wife or yourself. Don't do it. Time and distance will heal almost all heart wounds. After Officer Sullivan left me, I pondered his words. I decided I couldn't stand up to Amber in my current state. My father had been urging me to visit several manufacturers in the Midwest from whom we bought a lot of camping gear. I had been putting off the trip until spring because I didn't want to expose myself to the cold weather. So now I've decided to make the trip. I called my dad, heading home and thankful that Amber wasn't there. I quickly packed my bag, called Amber's cell phone, and once again luck was with me. My call went to voicemail. I left a message saying I was going out of town on a business trip, without any details. Honestly, I didn't think she would care. And I was right, because she didn't call until the third day, and I left a message on her answering machine. By the time I got home, I had cooled down and had a lot on my mind. Obviously, our marriage was over. I was still in incredible pain, but I didn't show it. As I entered the house, I called out to Amber and heard her fumbling around in her room. She came out and tried to kiss me. I pushed her away. We need to talk, I said and headed to the fridge for a beer. After drinking it, I sat down at the kitchen table. Okay, Amber said warily, what do we need to talk about? I want a divorce. She looked at me for a few long moments and sighed. Well, it doesn't matter anymore. I guess you found out about Jimmy and me. I thought you might have known because you went on a business trip. I also discovered that Jennifer and Todd are not my children, I snapped back. She went a little pale, but then a smirk appeared on her face. I'm sorry you found out, but it doesn't matter anymore. My eyes widened, and I shook my head. I don't even know what to think about what you just said. Are you sorry you got caught? Are you sorry you fucked Jimmy and got pregnant twice by him? Are you sorry I found out your dirty little secret? Are you sorry that I'm the fucking ignorant asshole who loved you? What are you sorry about? Amber didn't even deign to look embarrassed. No, I'm just sorry you found out about the kids. I was going to divorce you after my 35th birthday next week. I was just going to tell you that I don't love you anymore. After a decent amount of time had passed, I would have started dating Jimmy and we would have gotten married. Then, gradually, they would accept Jimmy as their stepfather. Eventually, when the time came, I would tell them that he was their real father. They would be old enough to understand and accept that. What's so special about your 35th birthday? I asked, because it still didn't make sense. I never told you, but my grandparents set up 3 separate trusts for me and my sister. $7 million was put into each trust. However, the terms of the trust required us to be married by age 25 and to remain married when we turned 35. At 35, the trust passed to us without any conditions. My sisters are older and moved out of the area when they married. I asked them not to mention the trust because I didn't want it to spoil our relationship. They were more than happy to keep the trust a secret. So why didn't you just marry Jimmy? Because my grandparents were very old school. According to the trust, my parents had to approve whoever I married. My father, especially, hates Jimmy. I knew my parents were friends with your parents, so they wouldn't have objected to you. I was seething inside. Amber had wasted 17 years of my life, cheated me out of my kids, and lied to everyone just to get her grandparents' money. What a stone-faced bitch. I wanted to spank her so badly, but I knew if I did it would turn out badly for me. While I was away, I read a lot about divorce and knew that violence would lead to the opposite of the desired result. Well, Amber, you've accomplished your goal, I grinned. Even if I file for divorce tomorrow, we won't be divorced until your 35th birthday. What a heartless bitch you are. Amber only smirked. Regardless of the consequences, I was sorely tempted to punch her in the face. It took all my willpower to hold back. Since you're a fucking whore and also a cheating bitch, I'm starting divorce proceedings tomorrow, I said as calmly as possible. If you want to call names, Justin, go ahead, Amber said, rolling her eyes. But let's try to go through this as civilized as possible. I think a quick and quiet divorce will be best for everyone. I walked right up to her and I said, fuck you. Then I stepped back and spit on her. You can hate me all you want, she smirked again. I'm going to marry Jimmy, and there's nothing you can do about it. Besides, you've got kids to think about. What about the kids? I asked. You're not going to broadcast that you're not their father, Amber said uncertainly. You don't want everyone to know you're a cuckold, do you? I grinned. I guess according to the old definition of a cuckold, I am one. The word comes from the cuckoo bird, which lays its eggs in another bird's nest and allows it to incubate the chicks. According to that definition, I am a cuckold. But the other definition I use is when a wife cheats and her husband consents to it. I certainly didn't consent to your cheating. And even under the old definition, the shame falls on the cheating wife, not the husband. So I don't care if people think I'm a cuckold. The children deserve to know. This is so like you, Justin. You throw your kids under the bus because your fragile male ego was bruised, Amber said with anger in her eyes. Oh, I'm not going to tell them, I smirked. You're the one who's going to tell them, and I'll be there when you do. And if you don't tell them, I'll show them pictures of you and Jimmy doing dirty deeds. Your choice. Of course, I didn't have pictures, but Amber didn't know that. She had to wonder how I knew about them, because having pictures of them made sense. The truth was that it wasn't Amber and Jimmy that I found out about. I found evidence that one of my children might not be mine. My blood type is A positive, and Amber's is O positive. Jennifer's is O positive, and Todd's is B positive. With those blood types, it would be impossible for Todd to be my son. But I didn't want to believe that, so I had DNA tests done. Amber burst into tears and threatened to publicly humiliate me. But I told her I would talk to them with or without her, and we finally sat down with the kids. The next day we were both waiting for the kids to get home from school. Kids, come into the kitchen. Mom and I have something to tell you, I called out as I heard them walk through the front door. Jennifer and Todd sat there with complete confusion on their faces. They looked from their mother to me and then back again. Kids, this isn't easy for you to say, Amber said, twisting a paper napkin, but your father and I are getting a divorce. The kids immediately became furious and I had to calm them down. Let mommy finish, and then we'll talk about it. It's no one's fault, Amber started again. But I slammed my palm on the table to stop her. For God's sake, Amber, I growled. Since you won't tell the truth, I will. You're old enough to handle it. Before I begin, however, I want you to know that I love you both unconditionally. I have no idea how your mother feels about you. You bastard, Amber blurted out. You know I love my children as much as you do. Yeah, whatever, I snorted, looking at my soon-to-be ex-wife. I then looked at both of my children and seeing the fear in their eyes, I continued. Your mother cheated on me, so I'm going to divorce her. But there's something else you should know. You're just going to be a real bastard on this one, aren't you, Justin? Snapped Amber. This is not easy for me and it breaks my heart, but while your mother was cheating on me, she got her lover pregnant and gave birth to both of you. I am not your biological father, Jimmy Swanson is. The children didn't say anything right away. They both had tears streaming down their faces. I was heartbroken that they were in so much pain. But at the same time, I knew that it was better for them to hear about it from us, rather than from the gossip that would almost certainly start going around town. Why, Mommy? Asked Jennifer through her tears. Why did you do this to Daddy, to us? Amber glared at me, then turned to her daughter. Because I love Jimmy Swanson. Let's get the whole truth out right now, I said in disgust to Amber. Your mother will inherit $7 million when she turns 35 if she's still married, which she will be. At one time she couldn't marry Jimmy because your grandparents were against it. Under the terms of the trust, if she had married against her parents' wishes, your mother would have been disinherited. Todd was already sobbing and Jennifer rose from her seat and stood in front of her mother. You did all this for money? You destroyed us for money? For money? Jennifer stepped forward and slapped her mother as hard as she could. Jennifer then lunged forward even more, knocking Amber to the floor. A second later, she was on top of her mother, slapping and punching her as hard as she could. I expected the conversation to be awkward and difficult, but in no way did I expect it to turn violent. It took all my strength to pull my 100-pound daughter away from her mother. Once Jennifer was under my control, I pushed her into the living room and told her to sit on the couch. Then I went back to check on Amber. She was slowly getting to her feet, but her nose was bleeding and her lip was bleeding. I hope you're proud of yourself, Justin, Amber said angrily. You really messed up your kids. Don't you dare be. Lay my father for this fucking mess, bitch, Jennifer yelled as she walked back into the kitchen. If you say one more bad word about Daddy, I'll scratch your eyes out. Amber backed away from her daughter. It was obvious that Amber was stunned and a little afraid for her daughter. Amber, I think it would be best if you found somewhere else to stay for the next few days, I said, trying to sound calm and judicious. At least until we have a chance to cool off. Amber was not pleased, but went to pack her bag. Before leaving, Amber looked into the kitchen again. It's okay, kids, I still love you. If looks could kill, Jennifer's looks would kill her mother right now. Amber was smart enough to realize she was out of luck and walked away. It took many hours for the children to calm down. Todd was still crying himself to sleep and Jennifer was terrified. Daddy, she asked when we were still sitting in the kitchen, will you still be our daddy? I would die if I lost you. Honey, in less than a year you'll turn 18, I said. Then you can decide what you want to do. Technically speaking, I don't think I have parental rights. But understand one thing, you'll always be my daughter, and I'll always love you. Jennifer smiled bravely at me before I kissed her goodnight. I then headed to Todd's room. He had finally stopped crying, but he looked completely miserable. No one slept well that night. I lay awake, reproaching myself for insisting on babysitting. But the more I replayed it in my head, the better I saw a way out of the situation. I guess I knew the kids would react badly to this news. They've both always been much closer to me than their mother. Jennifer had always been my little princess, and Todd and I shared many of the same interests. Besides, something else had been bothering me as I lay there. I realized now that all those supposed trips to the sisters were just a way to set her up with Jimmy. After my confrontation with Amber, she and Jimmy decided to start their relationship publicly. Amber didn't think she'd done anything wrong. She blamed everyone else for what she had done. It was her grandparents' fault for putting stupid conditions on the trust. It was her parents' fault for disliking Jimmy so much. And, of course, it's my fault for not being a decent husband. From what I've heard, Amber has been telling people that I'm cold and aloof, so she turned to Jimmy. Of course, she didn't say anything about the kids not being mine. Still, most of our friends looked at her like she had two heads. Listening to those stories made me even angrier than when I'd first learned the truth. I began to wonder how I could get back at Amber and Jimmy. I think it's common human nature, especially for a man, to want revenge on a cheating spouse and her lover. However, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I mainly wanted revenge on Amber. Jimmy was a simple working guy. He was cute and nice, but Jimmy wasn't the instigator of it all. I was tempted to tell everyone that I was not Jennifer and Todd's biological father. But I couldn't do that because of how it would affect my children. Yes, I considered them my children, and no matter how things turn out, I will always consider them mine. Days turned into weeks, and I fell into a deep depression. My whole world was shattered. The only thing that kept me from losing my mind completely was my job and my kids. After the disastrous confrontation between Amber and the kids, they stayed with me. They were the only light in my life. As the divorce process progressed, Amber was smart enough not to bring it up, even though she tried to patch things up with Jennifer and Todd. After a few calls, Amber stopped trying to contact her daughter. Jennifer was bitter to the core about what her mother had done. Their infrequent calls turned into screaming accompanied by swearing. Todd, on the other hand, communicated with his mother, but he was always depressed after their brief conversations. Jennifer was not handling her anger at her mother and Jimmy well. Todd, for his part, wasn't handling our breakup very well either. I finally decided that all three of us needed to seek professional help. I set up appointments for all three of us to meet with family counselor Mary Chaser. She wanted to meet with the three of us together and separately. The counselor also wanted Amber to attend the meetings. Surprisingly, Amber agreed to come. However, the first meeting of the four of us turned out to be a huge mistake. I had to physically restrain Jennifer when Amber made a snide remark about how the kids just needed to get over it. Afterward, I told Mary that if she wanted to see Amber at future sessions, we would not attend. Mary agreed that it would be wise to exclude Amber at this point. After that first meeting, I had a scary thought. What if the court took my children away from me and denied me visitation rights? For weeks I was haunted by the thought that I might never be able to see them again. My depression deepened. It was so deep that Mary prescribed antidepressant medication. It helped a little. Counseling didn't do much at first, but after a few weeks I started to feel a little better. Although I still wanted to get back at Amber and Jimmy, I had to put that on hold because Mary said that if I did something stupid, the court would almost certainly cut me off from the kids. The last divorce hearing in court was a complete mess. The judge got mad at Amber after reading the petition. Amber's lawyer acted like a horse's ass, and my lawyer seemed more interested in punching his opponent in the face than representing me. But one of the two decisive blows came from Jennifer, and the other came from the judge. The whole process showed me and everyone else what a selfish, cold bitch Amber was. Even though she had access to her trust, which had grown to nearly $10 million, she wanted her pound of flesh from me. Amber wanted half of the marital assets, the house, alimony, and half of my 401k. My lawyer did a pretty good job of explaining how Amber tricked me. Then he tried to paint me as some kind of saintly husband and father. After a few minutes, the judge told him to move on. However, his final appeal on my behalf was well thought out and emotional. He pleaded with the court not to encourage Amber's fraud. Then the issue of custody was brought up. Of course, Amber wanted full child custody with limited visitation rights for me. I'm sure Amber wanted to strip me of those rights because she blamed me for her terribly strained relationship with the children. But I'm also sure that her attorney advised her that the court would not take much notice of the attempt to completely exclude me. I, of course, wanted full custody of the kids with liberal visitation rights for Amber. My attorney told me I was dreaming if I thought the court would side with me. Before moving on to the custody discussion, the judge asked the children if they wanted to talk to him alone in the chambers. Jennifer jumped up and said loudly, "No, Your Honor, I prefer to have my words on the record." Todd stood up and said pretty much the same thing. The first to speak was Jennifer. Even though I could see she was scared, Jennifer stood at the lectern and looked at her mother. Then she looked at me, smiled, and whispered, "I love you." Jennifer cast a brief glance at her notes and then back at Amber. "I'd like to direct my comments to the future, Mrs. Swanson," Jennifer began, and I saw Amber tense up slightly. "Even though your birth certificate states that you are my mother, I no longer consider you as such. In my mind, my mother is dead. I want nothing to do with you, not now, not ever again. I will turn 18 next year, and I will be able to make my own decisions. You were never there for me while I was growing up, and I won't be there for you in the future." "That's not true," Amber exclaimed. The judge tapped his gavel. "Please, your attorney has already presented your case in this divorce proceeding. We are considering custody and I want to hear from the children. No more interruptions." Amber's face turned red, and I didn't know if she was embarrassed or angry. Whatever the case, I returned my attention to my daughter and she continued. "When I was 5 years old, I colored a picture for you. I waited all day for you to come home so I could give it to you. But when I gave you the picture, you patted me on the head and told me to color along the lines. Later, I found the picture in the trash can. Jennifer's face flushed, and she took deeper breaths. Nevertheless, she continued. When I was 9 years old, a carnival came to town. Daddy said we were all going. Todd and I were so excited to all go together. But at the last minute, you canceled the trip. To be with your lover, I guess. Anyway, Dad took us and we had a great time, but I was hurt that you didn't want to spend time with me. When I was 12, I got my first period. You were somewhere far away. You were always finding excuses to be away. Dad found me crying, with bloody pants. He hugged me and explained what was happening to my body. Dad comforted me, telling me that I shouldn't be afraid or embarrassed about what was happening. He then took me to the drugstore to buy the necessary things I would need. When you got home and he told you what had happened, you came into my room and handed me a box of sanitary napkins and a book about women's bodies. You said I would find the answers in the book if I had any questions. And then you left. Dad was more of a mom than you ever were. And those are just a few of the times you ignored me. Jennifer paused for a moment, wiping a tear from her cheek, and looked at her mother again. What you did to my father was so cold, calculating, and selfish. What you did to a man who only wanted to love you cuts my soul. What you did to me and Todd is reprehensible. I consider you beneath my dignity. The D. Otter's gaze shifted to Jimmy, and she picked up a bit of dirt from the podium. As for you, Mr. Swanson, you may have contributed a piece of sperm to the creation of Todd and me, but I care more about this piece of dirt than I do about you. Jennifer turned and looked at the judge. If you force me to live with her, I can guarantee that violence will be used. So in an attempt to prevent that, with the help of my grandfather's attorney, I have prepared a petition for emancipation. I want to be legally and completely separate from this woman. I want to divorce the woman who calls herself my mother. The judge was surprised by Jennifer's statement, but took the petition and put it with his other papers. Todd was the next speaker, and he was very nervous. He hated public speaking, but at the same time he realized that he had to do it if he wanted his point of view to be heard. I'm very nervous, he stammered. I'm not good at public speaking. But I have just as many stories as Jen about how my mother neglected herself, but I don't want to waste anyone's time. I just want to say I don't want to live with that woman and that jerk. Todd paused, and his cheeks flushed. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say jerk, even though that's exactly what I think of him. And I can't even look at that woman without utter disgust. I don't want to live with her, I want to stay with the only father I've ever known. Please don't make me live with them. Todd pointed at his mother and Jimmy. Then he went and sat down. I watched Amber and Jimmy during the children's presentations. Amber's face was even redder, and she was shaking. Jimmy, on the other hand, only got a little pissed off when Todd called him a jerk. Jimmy was a pretty malleable guy, but he clearly resented it when Todd spoke disparagingly of him. Amber wasn't happy with her kids, and I'm sure she was going to blame it on me. I didn't care since I agreed with everything they said. Amber wasn't the best mother, and now everyone knew why. When the kids were done, I thought the judge would remove himself to mull over his decision, but he didn't. Normally, I take a few days to weigh the arguments of both sides before making a judgment. But this case is so simple that I can only make one judgment. To begin with, this marriage was entered into for fraudulent purposes. Therefore, I will have it annulled. It will look as if the marriage never happened. I don't know what that will do to your credibility. I suspect nothing will happen because your parents were the only ones with any power. However, someone could challenge your trust and you would have to defend yourself. Amber's face went from bright red to pale white in an instant. She seemed to stagger briefly in her chair before Jimmy pulled her to him. The judge looked at Amber for a few seconds, then continued. Since there was no marriage, there is no marital property as such. You will both take what you brought into your life together, with the exception of Mrs. Williams' house and car. While it is obvious that Mr. Williams paid for the car, it is in her name and will remain her property. The house is titled in both names, so I assume that when the house is sold the proceeds will be split. If you analyze everything else, it appears that you, Mr. Williams, paid for approximately 90% of everything when you and Mrs. Williams lived together. Therefore, I am ruling that the entire investment must be split 90/10 unless Mrs. Swanson provides documentation that she contributed more than 10%. I glanced over at Amber and saw an absolutely furious woman. Obviously, this court hearing wasn't going the way she had envisioned. As for me, I was pleasantly surprised by what was happening. I had read all the horror stories about ex-husbands being raped in the courts. But everything changed once the judge ruled that the marriage never happened and I was not Amber's husband. As for the custody issue, I realized that Jennifer and Todd are very emotional, so I have to weigh in on the matter. If this were a traditional divorce, Jennifer would be old enough to choose who she wants to live with. However, I cannot grant him custody since Mr. Williams is not the biological father and I have ruled that the marriage is annulled. However, since she has already filed a petition for emancipation from her mother, I will allow her to live with her grandparents if they agree to take her in. Jennifer will be under their supervision until the emancipation petition is adjudicated. In any case, in about a year, she will be able to decide for herself where she wants to live. A quick glance at Amber surprised me. A tear was rolling down her cheek. Amber and Jennifer had never gotten along, especially in the last 5 years. I attributed it to Jennifer being a rebellious teenager. I compared it to how my sister and my mother used to fight all the time during my high school years. Now they were like 2 drops of water alike. But Amber and Jennifer's relationship had never been like that. Amber's betrayal of our family ruined any relationship with her daughter, at least for the foreseeable future. As for the custody of Todd Williams, the judge said with a grimace, I understand that he is very upset with his mother and would like to live with Mr. Williams. I repeat, Mr. Williams has no right to participate in the custody decision. Therefore, I award custody to Mrs. Williams and recommend that she grant Mr. Williams free visitation. However, I cannot order you to do so. And since Todd will be living with his mother, I am allowing Mrs. Williams to remain in the house. But other than your obligations to the bank, Mr. Williams, I cannot order you to make the mortgage payments. The judge quickly looked around the room and said, if there's nothing else, we'll call a recess. Todd got up so fast that he knocked over a chair. Then he ran out of the room, crying. Amber stood up and stared at me, and Jennifer came over and hugged me. I kissed Jennifer on the cheek and told her I would take her and Todd to lunch if Amber would let Todd come. Then I talked to my lawyer about getting the judge's ruling on the house overturned. In his opinion, there was no chance of that. So, I would have to pressure Amber to pay her half, but if she refused, I would make the payments. Too much equity was lost. Besides, my lawyer said that when the house sold, I could petition the court to be reimbursed for any payments I made on the house beyond 50%. Once in the hallway, I heard Todd yelling at Amber and Jimmy. I walked over and told Todd to calm down and wait outside. He reluctantly agreed. Amber turned to me, mad as hell. You think you've won, she poked me in the chest, but I got the house and the love of my life. As much as I didn't think Amber could hurt me anymore, what she said hurt me to the core. I wanted to slap her silly and beat the crap out of Jimmy. So it took all my willpower to stay calm and smile. Is it okay if Todd comes to lunch with me and Jennifer? I asked pleasantly. Fuck you. She hissed. No, Todd is not going out with you today or ever again. I don't want you to ruin him like you did to my daughter. If you believe that, you're the dumbest shit on this planet, I snapped back. My composure was waning. Hey, watch your mouth, Jimmy threatened me. Jimmy, if you touch me, I'll beat the shit out of you, and you know I can do that. I strongly suggest you back off. Jimmy saw the look in my eyes and decided not to push me. When I was satisfied that he wasn't going to be a problem, I turned to my never ex-wife again. I decided to go on the attack. Amber, you are undoubtedly one of the most selfish people in the world. Let me explain a few things to you. First of all, you don't have a golden pussy. Sex with you was pretty shitty, but then you got everything you wanted out of your toy. Besides, if I had to do it all over again, knowing what I know now, I'd do it again if I could be sure I'd have the same kids. Children have always been important to me. I stuck with you because it was a package deal, but I love them more than anything. So fuck you, I hope you have a horrible, misery-filled life." When I was done, I ran out of steam and needed to get out of there before I completely lost control of myself. I turned around and headed for the exit. I could hear Amber calling me a pathetic loser. She said I wasn't half as good as Jimmy, and sex with me made her nauseous. Todd didn't take it well when I told him that his mother refused to have lunch with us. I told him I was sorry, but the court had tied my hands. He started crying and begged me to take him with me. Until that moment, I didn't think I could feel any worse, but I was wrong. I hugged him and told him he had to go with his mother, but I wouldn't stop until I could get him back. The next 6 months were the worst of my life. I was filled with anger, rage, sadness, and deep depression. Amber appealed the judge's property division order, and I filed suit on behalf of the children to revoke the trust that Amber had received. I pointed out that since there was no marriage, Amber had not fulfilled the terms of the trust. But I lost in both cases. The Court of Appeal said that even though I was tricked into marrying Amber and our marriage was annulled, they considered her contribution to the household to be more than 10%. They awarded Amber 40% of our joint assets. However, my 401k was excluded. As for the trust, the court ruled that Jennifer and Todd were not named in the trust and therefore had no say. And, of course, the court ruled that I was never married to Amber, so I had no rights. They stated that Amber's grandparents were the sole trustees. And since Amber's parents and grandparents had died, Amber was now the sole guardian. In addition, the court viewed our cohabitation as a form of common law marriage. As crushing as the two Courtro OM defeats had been, the thing that frustrated me the most was that I couldn't get even a small rematch with either Amber or Jimmy. And even worse was the fact that I saw them in town all the time. They acted like teenagers in love, holding hands, hugging and kissing in public. It seemed like everywhere I went, they were there for me, and the emotional turmoil would start all over again. I couldn't take it anymore and moved to a town 15 miles away. Because the school districts were split, Jennifer didn't have to change schools. And of course, since Todd was living with Amber, his school didn't change. I tried to shut him out and put Amber in the past, but I couldn't. I kept having the same recurring dream. Jimmy was fucking Amber, and he was smirking at me. Then he would tell me, "Watch me put a baby inside your wife." I hardly slept at all and didn't eat well. The only good thing that happened in those first 6 months was Todd. He became such a pain in the ass that Amber finally called me to pick him up. It was one of the few times I laughed during those dark months. As Todd ran out of my old house with his bag, Amber and Jimmy went out on the porch to say goodbye. To my surprise, Amber had tears running down her cheeks. Jimmy just looked relieved. As Todd ran to my car, Amber yelled, "I love you." Todd kept up his pace and wagged his middle finger at Mom and Jimmy. This caused Amber to burst into uncontrollable sobs. I'm not going to apologize for feeling good about the situation. However, Jimmy put his arm around Amber and they hugged each other tightly. This turned my satisfaction into anger, but I did nothing but get in my car and drive Todd back to my place. I arranged for Todd to stay at his school for the rest of the year. I rented a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, and I believe it was only Jennifer and Todd's presence that kept me from going completely insane and doing something stupid. Besides, my obsession with getting revenge on the cheaters continued to fester. Still, I couldn't come up with a plan that wouldn't lead me to jail. However, I must admit that there were times when I said to myself, "Screw it, I'll just kill them," even though I knew I'd go to jail. But the thought of what would happen to my children pushed those plans out of my mind. My children were fully supportive and I was struggling to pull myself together. I knew that Jennifer and Todd were almost furious at my deteriorating condition. Finally, Jennifer took over the responsibility of the house. She cooked, cleaned, made sure Todd went to school and did his homework. In addition, Jennifer tried to make sure I ate and went to work. Finally, 9 months after the annulment, everything came to a head. I had a panic attack at work. I collapsed in my office and had trouble breathing. Everyone thought I was having a heart attack. An ambulance took me to the hospital where they ran a whole series of tests. When they decided I was having a severe panic attack, they referred me to a therapist. I resisted, but my father said that if I didn't go, he would make sure my children were taken away from me. My therapist, and Summers, was very good. She explained that I suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, the same as those who have been in combat or lost a loved one. Ms. Summers explained that I have to go through the 5 stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. And explained that I was stuck between anger and depression, unable to bargain. Amber confronted me with a fait accompli, and bargaining was out of the question. The panic attack was my body's first warning of what immense stress was doing to me. If I let the situation continue, it would eventually kill me. While I couldn't argue with Anne's assessment, I had no idea how to change it. Luckily, she did. I was told to keep a journal in which I wrote down all the bad thoughts I had about Amber and Jimmy. At the end of each one, I was to write, "I forgive them." At each session, I was to read my darkest thoughts about my not wife and we would discuss them. One of my thoughts was to shoot Jimmy in the head with a shotgun. After some discussion, I admitted that I could never live with myself if I killed someone, even if it was Jimmy. And then asked what the kids would think if I did something like that. I readily admitted that they would probably lose all respect for me. And so it was with every hateful thought I had. It kept coming back to the kids. Gradually, I let go of most of the anger and my life got better. Around the same time I was going to therapy, I realized that Jennifer was full of hate herself. She took it out on almost everyone except Todd and me. Sometimes Jennifer even took it out on Grandpa. Eventually, the father urged me to counsel the children. I did so immediately. When Jennifer and Todd went to counseling, I was politely informed that it was private. Jennifer never told me what she told the therapist, but Todd was always upfront about it. He told me about everything he discussed. He told me how angry he was at his mother. Todd felt that she had abandoned them and betrayed the family, especially me. But as angry as Todd was at his mother, he told me that Jennifer's anger was 100 times stronger. I can't explain why, but it made me very sad. 2 years after the annulment, Todd was at least talking to his mother. They couldn't be called warm conversations. Still, he was polite, and I could see that Amber appreciated the minimal contact, though she wanted more. But Jennifer refused to talk to her mother or have anything to do with her. About 4 years after the annulment, Jennifer got married. I tried to get her to invite Mom and Jimmy. Jennifer flatly refused. I told her it bothered me that she was holding so much anger inside. Jennifer smiled, stood up and kissed my cheek. "I'm not angry anymore, Daddy." People think the opposite of love is hate, but it's not. The opposite of love is indifference. I'm totally indifferent to this woman. I just don't care what she does, says, or thinks. She ignored me and betrayed our family. I was angry, but now I just don't care about her. We all have people we don't want to associate with, and she is one of those people for me. Having her around would ruin my wedding day, so they're both not coming. After being betrayed by Amber, I didn't think I'd ever get married again. But a year before Jennifer's wedding, I decided to marry Jean Wilder. Jean had dragged her feet on the matter after we had been dating for over a year. She told me that if I didn't propose to her, she would look for someone else. Jean openly stated that she wanted to have a family, so I had to make a decision one way or the other. I chose Jean. It was the best decision of my life. When we got married, I felt like I was finally living again. The demons of my past marriage were finally over. Of course, neither Jimmy nor Amber were invited to my wedding. The next 3 years were good. Jennifer gave birth to a boy, Justin, and 18 months later to a girl, Christina. She wouldn't let Amber visit her in the hospital, and they weren't invited to the christening. Amber was also not invited to birthdays or holidays. Jennifer cut Amber out of her life completely. In the years that followed, I rarely saw Amber and Jimmy. Now, at least if I did see them, it didn't drive me emotionally. I had become like Jennifer, I was indifferent to Amber. But suddenly Amber contacted me and wanted to meet to discuss the kids. It was very awkward for me to do this, but I felt it needed to be done. I walked over to Amber's table. She looked at me expectantly. I nodded and moved to the booth across from her. You look good, Amber, I said pleasantly. Where's Jimmy? Amber's face flushed slightly. We'll take a little break from each other. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, though I wasn't sorry at all. In fact, I already knew Jimmy was gone. I didn't know for sure, but I assumed Jimmy thought he was on easy street when my ex-wife got her inheritance. However, Amber was tired of Jimmy being a sponge. She wanted him to find a job and he didn't think too highly of that idea. Whether he would come back again or not, I didn't know or care. I just wanted to get this meeting over with as soon as possible, so I continued. What did you want to talk about? I pressed. I heard you recently got married and are expecting a baby, she said with a half smile. Congratulations, you will now have a child of your own. I'm going to have 3 kids, I said, frozen with anger. Amber realized she had made a huge mistake. I'm sorry, that was completely ill-considered, and I didn't mean it the way it turned out. I meant that I'm glad you're having a baby with someone who loves you. My muscles relaxed and I took the apology at face value. What do we want to talk about again? Justin, it's killing me that Jennifer refuses to see me or even talk to me, Amber sobbed. I haven't even seen my 2 grandchildren. I want to be a part of her and their lives. The thought was on my tongue that if she had been a part of Jennifer's life back then, there would be no problem today. But I held my tongue and decided to do the right thing. What exactly do you want me to do? I asked. Jennifer listens to you, Amber said desperately. If you tell her to talk to me, she'll listen. For that matter, I talked to her. I tried to get her to invite you and Jimmy to the wedding. I tried to talk her into inviting you to christenings and birthdays. I even offered to invite you when we planned to spend Christmas at my house. Jennifer not only refused my offers, but she threatened to stay home if I invited you over for Christmas. Does she hate me that much? Said Amber despairingly. No, she doesn't hate you, I said firmly. In her opinion, you didn't care about her when she was little, and now that she's grown up, she doesn't care about you. You chose your life and he chose hers. I wish I could convince her otherwise, but so far I haven't had any effect on anything. I'm sorry. Amber started sobbing softly and I stroked her arm lightly. I promise I'll keep trying. Maybe someday Jennifer will soften. I made such a mess, Justin, she said through her tears. I was so selfish and cruel. I'm so sorry. I know it doesn't mean anything right now, but I'm so sorry. I left Amber crying in the stall. As I walked to the car, my wife, Jean, was waiting for me with curiosity on her face. So what did your not wife want to talk to you about? Exactly what you thought, I said sadly. Amber wants me to help her get back into Jennifer's life. What does it say? My wife asked. You are the sum total of all your decisions in life. Yeah, that's true, I agreed. However, despite all the crap Amber has dropped on me, I still feel sorry for her. As I headed toward the house, it dawned on me that all the time I'd spent trying to come up with some kind of revenge on Amber had been a waste of energy. Amber had done it on her own. She had created her own hell and lived in it every day. The true part of this story. My friend's brother married a woman when they were both 29 years old. It was not a long courtship. According to my friend, they had only known each other for 4 months. Needless to say, the marriage was unstable. When the wife turned 35, she inexplicably filed for divorce. My friend's brother wasn't upset about the divorce because he was going to file for divorce himself. Then he found out that her grandparents had left her an inheritance if she married before 30 and stayed married at 35. The inheritance was not $1 million, but amounted to $650,000. The husband sued and the wife ended up paying him $125,000. Don't you just love happy endings?